What makes Brian May's guitar tone so legendary? Is it the gear, the technique, or something else entirely? In this episode, I'll show you how you can get closer to the iconic Queen sound even with the gear you already have. And I'll share with you some surprising lessons I learned along the way.
A lot of it comes from Rory Gallagher with me. His sound was just incredible. I got to talk to him and said, how do you do it? And he said, well, this is what I do, Brian. I have this little Vox AC30 amp and have a little treble booster here. And I had my guitar, and that was it. And I thought, well, this is what I want.
Inspired, Brian picked up 2 AC30s and a treble booster from his local music store. Combine this with his home-built guitar, these 3 pieces of gear became the foundation of his iconic tone. But as you can probably guess, there's much more to the story. Let's keep in mind that my point today is to analyze everything, and I want to distill the main Queen tone into one sound that I can reproduce that you can listen to, say, yeah, it's pretty close. You know, it does sound a bit like Queen, or it's pretty close to the Queen tone. The point is to use whatever I have on hand, use the knowledge that I've been able to extract from everything that I've found out about Brian May and his gear, and see if I can use the same philosophy and think more like what Brian May would, to use a modern Vox, this particular instrument, and a few pedals that I have on hand that should get me in the vicinity. Now, with that in mind, let's take a closer look at his gear over the years. So first off, there's the Red Special. The history behind it, all the specs are all out there on the internet, and there's a great video from 5 Watt World that I highly recommend if you want to know everything about the guitar.
My guitar has 3 pickups which can be arranged in different configurations. In other words, you can have any one of the 3, or else you can have 2 or more on together. If they're on together, they're in series, which means that they add their sounds together. But I have also a reversal switch here, which means that their sounds can subtract.
Now let's talk about the amps. And yes, there's more than one amplifier. Brian's mainstay over the years has always been the Vox AC30, but he used models from different eras and different production runs. Most recently, he's relied on his signature AC30 as well as some early 70s Greg Fryer modded amplifiers. Then there's the Deaky amp, which really deserves its own video, but for now, I'll stick with the Vox amps. His amps are also known for being paired with 2 Alnico Blue from Celestions, and there's also another cab that is loaded with an Alnico Blue and a 70th anniversary Celestion speaker. And as we can see for a lot of the live situation, the MD421 seems to be the microphone of choice for capturing the guitar sound. When it comes to effects, one thing is certain: Brian May has always relied on a treble booster throughout his entire career. Nowadays, he favors a Fryer treble booster, but in the past he's used models from Pete Cornish and of course the legendary Dallas Rangemaster. When it comes to modulation, it's either phasing or chorus. His go-to units are the Fox Foot Phaser and the Roland Chorus Ensemble. What's great about these effects is that they add just enough movement to the sound without overwhelming it. And let me tell you, these circuits are pretty unique. Not many modern pedals come close to replicating their character. Now let's talk about delays. Early on, Brian was using a pair of modified Echoplex units, but by the 1980s, he was experimenting with digital delays to perfect his wet-dry-wet setup. This involves using 3 amplifiers, so the middle amp doesn't get any of the delay, while the left and right are getting the delay signal.
I use a treble booster, which is a very simple little box. It's just a 1 transistor device which boosts the signal a bit and gives me a bit more sustain through the amplifier. It also knocks a bit of the bass end off, which cleans the thing up. And I'll show you what I mean by that. This is what it would sound like without the treble booster. Which is a very mellow sound and quite useful for some things. But if you turn it up in a stage environment, it gets very messy and woolly and makes this kind of confused noise. Which again is nice for some things, but you very soon get fed up with it because you can't really hear the individual notes.
The amplifier really does sound much darker than a modern AC15 like the one over there. I do have a WGS Black&Blue in this thing, which is a fantastic take on the Celestion Alnico Blue. Basically, WGS's take on that speaker sounds great through the amp. The issue I have with the modern AC15 is that it does not sound anything like a cranked vintage Vox. I know this because right over over there in that corner, I have a 1966 Vox AC50. So that's basically an AC30 that is cranked up in volume, but doesn't have all the bells and whistles. It's bright channel and normal channel. There's no reverb, there's no tremolo. It's as basic as it gets in terms of features. And when you crank this thing, it gets freaking awesome. Like, it doesn't sound anything like the modern Vox. The issue I have is that my amp needs repair. The transformer in this thing is starting to give up the ghost. It's cutting in and out when I crank it, so I can't give you that sound just yet. I'm on a waiting list that's like 6 months long. So I need to make this video, and sadly I couldn't use this, but I will revise, not revise, but I will come back to this video at some point and maybe try it with the AC50 and see what kind of tones I get. You can take my word on it. Crank, this sounds nothing like a modern AC15. The AC15 sounds very brittle and super bright. My first inclination here would be to take the tone cut and cut all of the brightness out of the amp, and then see when cranked if I can get in that territory. But from experience, cranking up the AC15 does get brittle. It kind of folds in on itself, and it doesn't sound as musical as a vintage Vox would. Depending on if you're playing with a humbucker or if you're playing with single coil, over here would be your humbucker, this would be your single coil. So right now, because I'm playing single coils, I'm just going to stick with this feature over here. And if we look at the volume here, it says that it's pretty much cranked to 10. The treble booster is at noon, and this one here, because I'm old and I can't read, is on the very first setting here on top, which I am not sure. I think it's a 70s model. Going into a cranked AC30, then there is this cabinet over here, which is the Alnico Blue, so both of them here, and they have a Shure SM57 and a Royer 121 for the microphones, so one microphone on each speaker. Now, the interesting thing that most of us don't take into account is the post-processing. Look at these EQs. And this one over here, if we're trying to replicate this sound without thinking about all the studio magic, that's where we fall short. So it's not just the gear, it's the know-how that's really important. So what I'm going to do now is just show you what kind of tone we're getting from this. I'm going to simulate the exact same setting over here. So I'm going to turn on all the pickups on my guitar, and I'm also using a 25-cent, which is a Canadian coin. It has the serrated edges, maybe not as pronounced as a sixpence, but I wasn't going to pay $14 for a sixpence. So I decided to use the Canadian currency, close enough for this project. So here we go. I have all three pickups instantiated, no reverse polarity. Here's how that sounds. So now the intriguing part is going to be taking this post-processing out of the equation so that we can hear what that sounds like. So here we go. So as you can tell, this is doing a lot to the signal. Very, very important. So if you were to have this pre-EQ sound, you would still be very close. So very interesting. Now what we're going to do is turn them back on and just compare. So let's do a quick recap of what we know so far. The coin does add to that sound because that metallic kind of tone that you get out of using a coin with this specific setup does have an impact compared to using a traditional guitar pick. So that is one key element. The other is an instrument that can do the reverse polarity. Now, depending on the guitar you have, you might be able to do this. If you have a Brian May guitar, you're going to be able to pull this off without a worry. If you get yourself something like this, you're going to have to get it modded because getting those pickups in series is really important if you want to push the front end of the amplifier. And if you want to get those reverse polarity sounds, it's also very important to do this. Now, going from this guitar to the amplifier, a modern Vox obviously is much better than if you're using something like a Fender Deluxe or whatever amp you have on hand that doesn't sound anything like a Vox. But if your intention is to crank the Vox AC15 or AC10, AC4, whatever you're rocking with, and then put a treble booster in front of it, I'm going to show that later in the video, but that gets really harsh. If you have a more woolly sounding amp, that treble booster is going to make more sense than trying to boost something that's already bright. The AC15 sounds nothing like the AC30, and that plugin sounds nothing like the AC30, which Brian May demonstrates in the video clip that I inserted into the video a bit earlier. So now what's another key ingredient that I think a lot of people miss, and I used to be one of them before I started researching this topic, and I'm going to show you what that is. This pedal over here, which is the Boss GE7.
You asked me to repeat a little history that I shared with you the other day when we were talking offline about my almost encounter with Brian May. So back when I was still working in retail, this must have been 1999 or 2000, on a Saturday afternoon, suddenly a guy came into the store and he was the guitar tech for Brian May. He said that the day before, just during a rehearsal, for some reason, they don't know what, might have been bad electricity or something, Brian's pedal board completely died. They weren't able to get a new one in time, especially not from the UK, and so he was asking if he could borrow a couple of pedals. And we were like, sure thing. He also offered in exchange that we would have like tickets for the show. And we were kind of surprised when we looked at his request, because he wanted a small pedal board with 5 Boss GE7 graphic equalizers. I was like, are you sure that's the only thing you need? Just a couple of equalizers? And he was like, yeah, that's the only thing I need, really. We put the pedal board for him, put it together, and we gave it to him, and the show went well. And on Monday, a courier or something brought the pedal board back, and we were so looking forward and hoping that the settings would still be applied to the graphic equalizers, but well, much to our surprise, everything was like flat. Everything was set back to 0. Yeah, that was kind of a bummer, but it was a fun experience nonetheless. We kind of were trying to wrap our head around what might have been the setting, and if he would have just used one or combined 1 or 2 or 3 equalizers to achieve a certain sound. I guess we'll never find out.
Now, the Boss GE7 is readily available. There are a lot of them on the market. I used to own a Japan version, and now I have a Taiwan version. They do the same thing, so don't overthink that part of it. And even if you have a more budget-friendly pedal that has the same values, and I'm talking about the specific frequency bands, you're going to be able to pull this off. So it's not all over the songs, but it's in enough of them that we can use these EQ settings and try to replicate. So what I'm going to do here is look at the different songs. So this one here is Bohemian Rhapsody, the solo. I'm going to pay attention to the settings for this particular example, and I'm going to look at the settings on the EQ. I'm going to take those and replicate the settings on the guitar and on the GE7 and when I'm going through the AC15 a bit later in this video. But right now, what we're going to do is look at where else that GE7 is being used. Now, again, we're seeing it here for I Want It All for the solo section, and a bit different in EQ curve than what we saw earlier. So if you change the order, it's going to have an impact. So this is specifically placed right after. So we're going to see what that does. Let's look at where else we can see the GE7. So for Killer Queen, that is a lot of frequencies, high frequencies that are getting cut out. So we're going to try that out. And again, here for 7 Seas of Rye, we're noticing that a few of the high frequencies are getting cut out. Somebody to Love, we have the GE7 again. Under Pressure for the clean guitar, we have the GE7. But this time we notice that the EQ is before the treble booster. So that means that depending on what you're playing, that EQ in relation to the treble booster is either going to be before or after. biggest lesson I've learned through this whole experiment was the idea of having a sound in your head. It doesn't really mean a whole lot if you don't have any context behind that. A sound in your head. Is it Eddie Van Halen's sound? Is it Dino Cazares' sound? Whose sound is in your head? Or is it an ideal, like characteristics you're looking for? If you can be honest with yourself, if you haven't found that sound yet, how would you describe that sound? What are, like, let's say the top 5 things you look for? Is it sustain? Is it clarity? Is it the gain itself? Is it the character? So when you can start to articulate what sound you're looking for, then you can look for the right piece of gear. Lesson number 2 is all about really taking the time to understand your gear. If you look at Brian May's gear, it's pretty simple. It looks deceivingly simple on the outside, on the surface, but if you start to dig into it, he can pretty much squeeze any tone he wants from it. The guitar has different voicings with the switching system. He's also riding that volume because his amp is cranked up all the way. It's a 1-channel amp. There's nothing fancy going on with any amp switching systems and different channels and stuff. He understands his mic placement that he likes. He knows which microphones he likes. That is also part of the sound. And then there's the EQ, there's the Treble Booster. That's also adding to this coloration of the tone. So he's been pretty much using the same gear forever. He's going to refine it, do different things to it, but essentially he understands how to get the sound from the gear he has, which is kind of humbling for me because I have a lot of gear and I don't always take the time to get to know it. And I think we could all learn from that. Now, lesson number 3 is about not chasing the latest trends. You never see Brian May like rocking the latest PRS or the new amp from such and such company, or, you know, a new signature pedal that he has, or he's rocking an original clone or anything like that. There's a lot, and don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that, but his philosophy seems, from what I've been able to, look at throughout the years, is that if it isn't broken, why fix it? So he's been playing with the AC30s. They break down on him. He gets them fixed. They come back in. He could have gotten annoyed with the AC30s and just move on to something like, I don't know, Batcat or Matchless or whatever. No, he's stuck with it and he keeps getting them repaired and he doesn't overthink the gear. The latest pedal that can do this or that doesn't seem to bother him. And if you look at his rig rundown, he's been playing the TC Electronic Major 2 forever. He uses it for chorus and delays. Could have used anything. He's Brian May. He could have hit up, I don't know, Strymon and say, hey, send me your best delay pedals. They would have. I have no doubt about it. But he doesn't do it. If it works, he sticks with it. I mean, he's so into, if it works for me, I don't overthink it, that he's been sporting the same haircut since the 1970s. And, all kidding aside, he has the same guitar tech for like over 20-something years. He knows what works. He doesn't look at the new stuff. He just sticks with what works for him. And I know some people are going to say, yeah, but he's Brian May. He plays in Queen. He's not doing corporate gigs. He's not doing, cover bands. So what? The idea is you could have a Blues Junior with a Strat and 5 pedals, and no one would care if you don't have the same sound as Brian May or Eddie Van Halen or anything. If you play well and the band is good, no one cares what your gear is except you. Lesson number 4 is about refining your gear. He doesn't say, okay, well, this pedal doesn't work for me anymore. I'm going to go get something else that's completely different. Rather, he'll send his pedals or his amps or his guitars over to qualified people who can make the modifications he's looking for. I know this is not readily available for everybody. Like, I can't just hit up, Brian Wampler and say, hey, do you think you could do these mods to my pedal? I mean, he would jump on it. That will never happen. But if we take just the concept that perhaps you like the Tube Screamer, and the Tube Screamer that you have, maybe the noise floor is too high for you. Maybe there's someone else that makes a Tube Screamer where that noise floor is all the way down, still does what you want. Okay, then you switch over to that pedal and you're settled. Maybe the amp you have, you've outgrown it, but you like the Fender sound. that you've been having, or the Marshall sound. Maybe you upgrade to something else within that same ecosystem instead of just going for something completely different. So this refinement doesn't have to be us sending our gear over someone so they can fix it. It could be maybe you've outgrown something, but you like what you had to begin with, and you just need something that does something different for you. And if you know what that is, you can make better decisions. Lesson number 5 is about mastering the basics. I'm talking about EQ, I'm talking about dynamics, and I'm talking about your overall sound and equipment. For example, you have an amp, there's an EQ section on there. Do you know how to use it when you're in a room? Because if your amp has a 3-band EQ or more EQ than that, sometimes what sounded good in the bedroom won't sound good on stage or at a venue or wherever you're playing. So understanding that you need to start with the EQ to tailor what you need is a pretty basic element, but such a game changer when you really start to understand it. By dynamics, if your amp is super saturated, I mean like there's no articulation, anything you play can't really be distinguished, then you probably need to bring that saturation down. And sometimes you're going to have the perfect gain, but that gain won't be perfect with all the different sections of the song. So if you look at what Brian May does, his clean parts is a cranked up amp with the guitar volume rolled down. And sometimes we forget that that guitar volume is there. The tone is also on that guitar. That can sometimes help you when the singer's out front just struggling to be heard and your guitar is super bright. Maybe you need to turn that tone down. There's that EQ part, and then there's the dynamics. Sometimes you need to play clean, sometimes you need to play much louder, more in your face. But understanding that within the context of a song, within the context of a band, is super crucial. And I could tell by the different presets, and I believe those presets were made by the great guitar player Jamie Humphreys. So if you've ever seen, I think it's called Six String Alliance, great YouTube channel. You should definitely subscribe to him. He's the one who made the presets. He's played with Brian May, so obviously he understands that tone. And as I'm going through all the different presets, I could tell that dynamics was very different sometimes between the solo, the riffs, and the clean part. And it's all within like the same kind of setting. It's the same amp, same guitar, same pedals, but just tweaked differently. So understanding that is another game changer when you really pay attention to it, because if you're in a band and you need to be heard, you need for the other people in the band to be heard, understanding how to control your EQ, understanding how to play with dynamics makes a huge difference. So this is going to be a bonus tip. It's just for those of you who stuck around and were great enough to really stick through the whole video. I know it's not for everybody. It's really nerdy, but you know, if you stuck through, thank you so much. I really appreciate you. So this bonus tip is about mic placement and the reverb. So if you ever listen to any of the Queen tracks in isolation, like the guitars in isolation, you're going to notice that sometimes Brian will use like plate reverb or whatever type of reverb he's using, but most of the time the reverb is the room that he's in. So he's going to have some dedicated, perhaps, I'm just guessing here, probably have some dedicated room mics, but he also has a tendency to play with the microphone, how far they are from the amp. And to me, this is just a reminder that taking an SM57 and just sticking it to the grill is more of a live sound guy thing. When you're in a studio, you should experiment with getting some of that room tone. Yeah, maybe the room is kind of disgusting, but maybe that sound is really cool with whatever you're doing. So sometimes just backing it up from the amplifier, or maybe playing with the microphone more on the edge of the whole cabinet instead of on the speaker, will give you like a more muffled sound. And we can hear that in some of the demos where you're like, how is this microphone placed? So not sticking to conventions, just trying whatever works is probably a good starting point for any creative person, especially for guitar players looking for unique tones. It's really fun to have all this digital gear where we can do stuff, but sometimes there are limits to what we can actually do within the realm of a plugin or, let's say, a modeler. So when you have an actual amp and an actual microphone, you can do different things. You can take a reverb from your house, from a room that you're in that is unique. It's not a plug-in, it's something that you captured that's going to make you sound different. And I think that's one of the elements which I really appreciate from Brian May is the uniqueness of his guitar tone. I don't think anyone else sounds like him. He really has one of the most unique guitar tones in all of rock history, if you think about it. So yeah, the reverb and the mic placement was another revelation for me. So I hope you got something out of that portion. Now that I'm done with the whole Brian May video, I'm probably going to take a few days off and go listen to some Deep Purple, because there's another guy who has a killer guitar tone, but apparently uses far less gear than Brian May did. So a Strat, a British amp, some say it's a Marshall, others say no, it was actually a Vox amplifier, probably an AC30. And there's word of a Treble Booster somewhere in there. So Treble Booster and a Vox. I think I can do that. So yeah, I'll take a few days off, try to replenish, all this energy from over a month of working. And I think I'm going to try and aim Ritchie Blackmore's guitar tone. If you're interested in that, if you're that kind of person, might want to check out the video appearing on screen right now. And if you are, I'll see you over there. And this should be fun. Cheers. So lesson number 2 is actually a pretty simple one. There we go. No. Oh my goodness. Oh yes, you're very nice. Yes, you're very nice. Yep. But I'm recording. Oh. I'm recording. Oh, so well, that can make a good blooper. Yeah, it'll make a good blooper. What do you want? What do you want?